Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this North American chapter of WAPP's session on the growing role of PPPs in North America. There are two aspects that we are going to talk about very briefly today and give ample chance for questions and answers. And that is on the internal infrastructure that is being built through PPPs within each of the countries. So this is North America, the United States, and Mexico. And then we will also touch on interconnected infrastructure between the nations, and especially trans-border infrastructure that exists between Canada and the United States and the United States and Mexico, and how these are being facilitated or implemented through PPPs as well. Transnational PPPs are one of the most interesting type of PPPs that are emerging, especially as we have situations with global economies evolving, where there's interconnectivity. There are strengths of this and advantages, and there are also challenges. And the biggest challenge really is matching different legal systems, standards, etc., when you have to build these linear projects across borders. I'm going to hand over to Laurie Tanous, who is going to be the moderator. She represents Laurie Tanous and Associates, and she's a trans-border legal expert and has worked on numerous types of projects in this area. So she is really one of the best people who we could have got to lead this presentation. So thank you, Laurie, for joining us. I will hand over to you now, and you can introduce the other speakers, and good luck.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. In terms of our amazing lineup of speakers today to help us understand some of the challenges and opportunities that exist within North American infrastructure projects. First up, unfortunately, he's having some technical issues, but he will join us as soon as he's able to, Mr. Morteza Farajian from the Build America Bureau. Then we have Ms. Lisa Mitchell from the Canadian Council of P3s, and then Mr. Oscar Cortez, Vice President of International Relations at the Mexican Federation of Professional Civil Engineering Colleges, FEMSIC. So good morning and welcome to all of you today, and thank you for being here with us. We're looking forward to your exciting and informing news as we're going to go through our dialogue. So just to let the audience know, what we're doing today is opposed to having presentations, because if you were able to tune in yesterday, the respective units for each of these countries have already presented a PowerPoint presentation and spoken to it. So today we are going to ask a series of questions to each of the speakers to get their insights from the respective countries. Please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer chat box, and I'll be looking out for them throughout the presentation, but then also at the end as well. So, Oscar, we're going to start with you. I'm going to give Lisa a little bit of a break. She'll go second. And then David, if you don't mind stepping in to speak for the U.S. until Morteza is able to join us, that would be fantastic. So first question, what are the most important PPP projects or initiatives that are currently underway in your country?
Laurie.
Mm-hmm. Did you hear me?
Can you repeat, please, Laurie? I think we...
Mm-hmm. Is Oscar frozen or am I?
Oscar's frozen.
Oscar's frozen. Okay. Well, Lisa. Oh.
It's in your end.
Oscar, do you want to try maybe taking the video off but still speaking to see if that would unfreeze you? Sometimes that does the trick. Okay, you know what, Oscar? Oh, okay. I was going to say we could move on, but if you're here, well.
I'm here. So you want me to self-introduce, or? Okay, so my name is Oscar Cortez.
No,
I'm the BP for International Relations for the Mexican. I am also a
Oscar, you're cutting out. So I'm going to move on to Lisa right now, and then see if you can do something with your connection, please. I know Oscar had said that he was having some connection issues this morning. So Lisa, if you could talk to us first a little bit about what you do at the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, and then let us know what's going on in Canada, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And my colleague Andrew did a session yesterday. We're a bit of a unique organization. There aren't many of us, I think, like us in the world. We're a not-for-profit industry association, so we're membership based, and our membership represents both the public and the private sector participants, market participants in P3s. So we have government officials on the public sector side, as well as some procurement agencies and PPP units at different levels of government, as well as all of these. So we're sort of soup to nuts on the life cycle approach of delivering infrastructure. So we have everybody from the legal advisors and financial advisors, technical advisors, right through to the facilities maintenance folks on the other end, as well as the financial community. So we have not only broad membership in terms of what parts of the life cycle that they represent, but also in terms of asset classes. So a lot of expertise and to draw on. So that's a bit in a nutshell of us. I mean, I think the question about what are the most important PPP projects or initiatives, I mean, in a country like Canada, that's a difficult question. You could look sort of on the grand scale of significance in terms of nation building. We're a very big country with very diverse needs. Connectivity is also huge. So, I mean, importance could be, importance of our gateways and moving people and goods, but importance, I think, in our circumstances, and I think very similarly to a lot of other countries, are the local needs as well too: water, wastewater treatment facilities, access to affordable housing. So I think that there's a lot going on. I think we've got a really established market for availability-based P3s. We don't have a lot of PPPs where concession models or where there's demand or revenue risk transfer. I think that's a new area for us. We have partial, but not full. And so there's some area of growth, I think there. But we do have a lot of, and broadband is a new and emerging asset class for us. And, and globally, that's, I think, especially with COVID, that we've recognized the importance of those types of projects. So we're trying to figure out how we can take Canada's availability-based model and apply it in those new asset classes. Green energy, we've got transmission lines across Canada that need to be built. But because of who we are as a country and what we look like geographically and our connectivity to North America and other markets, trade and transportation is always going to be a huge part of what we do. So looking at projects that are coming forward, like the via high frequency rail, which is very early stages of the procurement process. The federal government has released a request for expressions of interest that just closed, but they are looking at incorporating design, build, finance, operate, maintain, and what the structure looks like and how that evolves. We'll see over time. But lots of opportunity there. We've got new types of PPP structures in ports. But our local communities too, the municipalities really in the provinces own a lot of our infrastructure. So you do still need local roads, water and wastewater treatment facilities that can, meet new regulatory requirements as well as demand, district energy. So it's a bit of I think it's a bit of a loaded question in terms of what important, because I think if you'd ask anybody who's about to build something, that they're all important to them. But I do think there's quite a bit going on in the space. But I would say in the Canadian market, we're also at a bit of an evolutionary point, and I think it goes to the new asset classes and the new ways of thinking things through and harnessing lessons learned, where we're really good at availability based, but how do we broaden that, and then how do we incorporate PPP principles and attributes into new and innovative approaches? So that's a bit, I would say, overall sort of snapshot.
That's great. That's what we were looking at, is a 50,000 foot level of what's going on in Canada. And I'm always, wherever I am, the first thing I try and say is I'm Canadian, so that I can put that out there in terms of, as you say, we have been very good at the availability model, but I love to hear that, we're now looking at how can we improve in other areas and what are other things that we can do. So thank you for sharing.
And I think, one thing that's different in sort of the North American context, and I know David will talk about the States as well too, is the role of the federal government versus subnational level of governments in infrastructure delivery. And in the Canadian context, the federal government actually owns very little. very, very little, like 2 to 3% of public asset classes. So the role of the federal government is very much as a funder to help support subnationals. So the provinces and territories are largely responsible for things like healthcare and education, law enforcement, and then the municipalities have, local roads, bridges, water, wastewater, energy from waste. So the federal government oftentimes as a funder, there's lots of ways the federal government will fund. Some of it is just sort of transfers, and other times that there's merit-based connections or policy imperatives that need to be connected to the flow of funds. So that also has an impact in terms of what gets prioritized as well too, is what the federal government might look as priorities for them to flow their funds through.
And that's a helpful distinction, I think. I often get asked that, and I say it's one of the first things I learned in my first year of law school is this is what the federal government does, this is what the provincial, this is what the municipal, and this is what each one owns and each one's responsible for. So I think that is a good distinction to bring in. Maybe David, you can speak to us about the U.S. and what while we're waiting for Morteza to join us. You're on mute.
Thank you, Lisa. As you said yesterday, there are many similarities, but also dissimilarities between how things are done in Canada and the United States. I think the first thing to point out is, with us also being a federal system, that the federal government in the United States, through the Build America Bureau and the Department of Transportation and other agencies, can provide guidance on how PPPs are implemented. The Build America Bureau, for example, also does a lot of work when it comes to capacity building of state and local governments. And what they have done is, to promote the milieu, the setting for PPPs. Most PPPs, however, are done at state level, and not all states are equal. So often when people talk to me about the United States and the role of PPPs and how they implement it, I say almost that you've got to look at the United States as 50 different countries, because they have their own state guidelines, policies, laws for implementation of PPPs. It's interesting that with the latest initiative of the Biden administration, everyone's heard about the Infrastructure Act and the enormous amounts of money that have been poured into infrastructure. It's, I would say, has dinged PPPs a little bit at present, because with the result of this money flowing down, the infrastructure funding gap is less acute as it used to be. So maybe the incentive for looking at PPPs as a way to bridge the infrastructure funding gap is less important or less acute now. And so really you have to look at states. And for example, in the United States, there are some outstanding states that have excellent records. The state where I live in, Virginia, is a leader of PPPs. And so much so that when the Build America Bureau got its new director, which is Morteza, and hopefully he will be able to join, he was stolen or recruited from the state of Virginia to head the federal program. Other states that have very active programs are, for example, Maryland, Texas has, and then also California stands out. And Sam Baidoun, who spoke yesterday about PPPs, mentioned, for example, the very large light rail project that's taking place in Los Angeles, for example. And the one thing that's really interesting about PPPs in the United States is they are much more focused on infrastructure, not like Canada, which also is focused on sort of social services. So one of the biggest programs in Canada is, for example, hospital PPPs. They really don't exist here in the United States because we don't have a national healthcare system. We have a system of private facilities. However, I do believe that, some of these federal things like the Veterans Administration, which runs its own hospitals, might in the future have some interest in PPPs. But I'm going to end there. It looks like we've got Oscar back, and I'm sure Oscar would love to tell us a lot more about what's happening in Mexico.
Thank you, David. I apologize, everybody, having some technical issues over here with broadband, which is part of the infrastructure, actually. We need to improve that connectivity, especially along the U.S.-Mexican border. So a little bit of background on me quickly. I am a binational civil engineer. I am the VP for International Relations for FEMSIC, which is the Federation of Civil Engineer Colleges. And I'm also a consultant, and I've been working in Mexico, Latin America, and specifically on the U.S.-Mexican border in different types of projects, from ports of entry to transportation projects to water projects. So I have an experience of more than 30 years. And what I can say about Mexico is that we have a history of promoting P3 that goes back a couple decades. There is a lot of lessons learned. You know, in the 1990s, we were very aggressive with the road infrastructure to P3s, and there were some mistakes. So out of that came reforms, and also out of that, in 2012, there was a P3 law enacted, a federal P3 law, which really creates an institutional strong framework for Mexico. Now, each state in Mexico has its own particular P3 law. We are like United States. We have 30 states in Mexico, and each one has its own particularities. But we are very heavily guided by the federal government in Mexico, which is one of the situations we have here. Projects. Well, right now, the current administration has really promoted projects in the southern part of Mexico. We have big infrastructure in Yucatan with the Tren Maya, which has some components that are P3. That's one of the largest infrastructure projects in all Latin America. We also have a big refinery being built in Tabasco. It's called Dos Bocas. We have a very interesting project called Tren Intersísmico. Basically, is a dry channel with rail that connects the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. And it is very interesting because one of the situations we want to move forward is promoting trade, not only with the United States, certainly with other countries, and that's a good project. And from the perspective of creating P3s, I think it's important that we leverage the U.S.-Mexican-Canada Accord. It is an opportunity to really improve on the current infrastructure. We have 48 ports of entry. Some of them need a lot of upgrades. Some of them need a lot of interconnectivity with rail to create a better supply chain logistic approach. There are new projects on board. We have the Otay 2 project that's to be finished in around the year 2024. That'll be a new port of entry, a brand new facility. And there are other projects, one in particular in Chihuahua, New Mexico, San Jerónimo, Santa Teresa. That's another one that is in the earmark. So I'll let the other speakers chime in, and well, so certainly we can talk about more issues later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Welcome, Morteza. Sorry about the technical difficulties you were having, but happy to have you with us for our North American chapter discussion on how our infrastructure is interconnected. So we just heard from David, Lisa, and Oscar, but would love for you to please introduce yourself, what you do within your organization, and then the question that was posed, a very high level, 50,000 foot, but what are the current important or significant projects currently underway in the United States that you want to share with us?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where everyone is, but it looks like that we have people from all over the world. Glad I could finally join you all. A lot of technical challenges, but finally it worked. I'm actually in Canada right now myself, on vacation. So talking about cross-border projects. I'm already on the other side of border, northern side, but David, I think I heard that David talked a little bit about what we do at Build America Bureau. Bureau was created about 6 years ago at U.S. Department of Transportation to be the one-stop shop that has two main loan programs. One bond program that we can allocate tax-exempt status to bonds that private entities issue to finance infrastructure projects. It's called private activity bonds. And we are supposed to provide technical assistance to folks who want to consider innovative delivery models like P3s, as well as innovative financing options. It could be even a public entity that is trying to finance a project, provide best practices, and so on. Um, I have been with the Bureau about 4 years. David mentioned prior to joining Bureau, I was with Virginia DOT. I was there for about 8 years, helped to procure about $14 billion worth of projects, a very good profile portfolio of projects that we developed in Virginia. Some of those projects were very successful. I-66 outside Beltway is one example I used that we even got some money from private sector to build it for us, and we used that money on other infrastructure projects. So altogether, a very good unit, not very big, about 10 people. My team at Bureau is now about 40 people, 45 people. We have very lean team, but we do a lot of important things. When it comes to P3s, as David mentioned, in US, we have many different states. Some are active, some are not active. Many programs have been actually modeled after the program that we built in Virginia. Some of these programs have been around for years. Some of them are relatively new. What we try to do is really to bring everyone to the table, try to share experience between different stakeholders, and make sure that everyone is doing these P3 projects the right way. I mean, that's really the key for us, because we don't want these projects to be done simply because P3 is an easier path forward for some of project sponsors. They don't want to consider other options, such as financing the project on their own. We really want them to procure projects as P3 when and where it makes sense, and where the P3 model truly delivers a superior result, superior value to people, to public sector, and so on. One of the new tasks that we have, and in the past we had it too, but our role has been expanded as part of IIJA, is we are going to require value for money analysis, and the value for money analysis we're going to require is going to be slightly different than the value for money analysis that some of you might be familiar with. It's not going to be a series of formulas and calculations and trying to come up with two numbers that says one side is 20% or 10% or 15% more advantageous than the other side, based on a lot of high-level assumptions that are not backed by real data. The one that we are going to require, and we are in the process of drafting guidelines for it. Sam yesterday might have talked a little bit about it, because he's in charge of that effort for us, is going to be more practical. It's going to really look at all options, and as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that project sponsors are truly looking at all options that they have, and really do a SWOT type analysis, the strengths and weaknesses of each option, opportunities and threats, risks of each option, and put everything on table. Come up with what goals and objectives they want to have. Make sure that they set those goals and objectives clearly, and then explain how they have made their decision. It's all about transparency. It's all about data-driven, data-backed decisions, and it's also about accountability, making sure that this document is going to be publicly available, so everyone would know exactly how the decision was made, why it was made, and based on what facts and assumptions that decision was made. And then, of course, later when we will require them to report back to us and say that whether those assumptions that they made is it still valid or it has changed. So that was a very high level overview. Between the two lending programs we have $110 billion. That's with B. So you can see that we have a lot of financing capacity that we can provide to these P3 projects. Our loans are very flexible, low interest rate. We can even go now up to 75 years after substantial completion of the project for the term of the loan. So some of these projects, especially tunnels and bridges that have a long life, they can be paid over a very, very long period of time. I'm not aware of any financial instrument like that available in market. It's also new to us. We're trying to still figure out how we're going to underwrite those loans. But there are a lot of good projects out there that we are helping them right now. Going back to your question, we do see an increase in the number of express lanes or managed lanes in US. The network that we have created in Northern Virginia is a good example. It is functioning well, functioning as it was intended from the beginning, and others are trying to create similar networks. Maryland, which is a neighboring state to Virginia on the other side of Washington, D.C., they have a big project that they're working on, as well as a couple of other states that are working on managed lanes, toll roads. We have one in Georgia. Alabama has been talking about toll bridges and toll roads, and we are helping them. We're providing the technical assistance that they need. We're providing the best practices that they need, and as I mentioned earlier, we're the link between them and their peers to learn from their experience. Oscar mentioned one good project that you're involved in, that the border crossing between California and Mexico. That's one of the good projects that I don't know whether it's P3 or not, but or how it depends maybe on how we define the P3. But that's a good project that we're working on it, and we're trying to finance it in partnership with our friends in San Diego. The other thing that comes to my mind is really transit-oriented development. I want to mention this, and this is my last point, that I do see a huge surge in terms of real estate development around transit agencies, and that's one of our priorities. We have funding to subsidize those loans, and we are eager to work with those who want to actually have P3 projects that are going to be defined around transit agencies to better use land around transit agencies.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Morteza, for that great overview. I know it was a general question. It was intended to be that way, just to get the discussion started. The team and I, the North America chapter team and I, we often joke about, how passionate I am about cross-border and transnational projects because I live and breathe this stuff every day. So that leads us into the next question that David Baxter has posed to us. So I'm going to start with you, Lisa, and then Oscar, and then Morteza. So how can national infrastructure be integrated for transnational or cross-border P3 projects? Keeping in mind, I am in Windsor, and so Gordy Howe is near and dear to my heart. I've worked a long time on that project, so just throwing that out there.
Yeah, it's a natural place to go. Yes. I mean, I think, there is a lot of discussion. Canada's got, multiple gateways, but the Ontario, Quebec, and the connection to the US border, I think is, obviously very, very big one. It's very long as well. Lots of points of entry. So, I mean, in terms of, are there projects on the horizon? I think there's a lot of discussion about, what can be done to move, to more easily flow goods and people across the border. So whether it be rail projects, but, in particular, I think we're living and breathing one right now as two countries, and you're in Windsor. And so you can, I don't know if you can see it out your window, but there is currently, and I think it'll be a bit of a pilot project, I think, a new bridge going in, a PPP bridge between the cities of Windsor in Ontario, Canada, and Detroit, Michigan, which is a huge, huge port of entry and in particular for trade between the two countries. So this bridge, just a little bit about the bridge, it's under construction right now. It's going to be 6 lanes. It's about 2.5 kilometers long, or 1.5 miles, if that's a bit of an easier point for you. We measure things differently between the two countries as well, so it's a bit of a challenge. You need 2 sets of data. It'll be the longest main span of any cable-stayed bridge in North America once it's complete. Will be one of the top 5 largest in North America as a whole. It includes ports of entry, so we do have customs and border agents and those components on both sides of the bridge to consider. It will be tolled, and will actually be the largest Canadian port along the border, the shared border. So it's a significant project. It's been a long time in the making. I think we have an additional question on, some of the challenges, so I won't get into that just yet. But I really do think that it will be a bit of a marker for how PPPs can be implemented across the two countries. And I think as people, start to conceptualize other opportunities for cross-border, we'll be able to turn to this project, harness the lessons learned, and what worked, what didn't, and adapt as necessary. And of course, every asset class comes with and every project comes with its own unique set of circumstances. But I think what we're also starting to see in the Canadian context is interprovincial projects as well too, in particular in energy. And that also is a consideration, I think, in between the two countries as well, but very much focused right now in terms of the interprovincial energy projects. And I think there are, as I said, I don't want to jump ahead, but there are a lot of considerations. There's PPP considerations in terms of the delivery model and how you move that forward. And then there's considerations about how you deliver a project regardless of procurement model between two governments, with a border in between. So we'll come to that later. But I do think the Gordy is sort of our first big example, and a lot of lessons will come out of that, I think.
Thank you, Lisa. And so I live half the time in Detroit, Michigan, and half the time in Windsor. So I can actually see the construction from my Detroit office. So every time I'm like, oh my gosh, now this is happening. Now that's happening. So, but thank you. Thank you for providing us with that overview. And Oscar, over to you now. And you and I have talked about the work I've done, for the San Diego and Tijuana border. So I know that you can definitely share your expertise on the cross-border Mexico-U.S. projects, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, like you, I live half the time in Tijuana, half the time in San Diego. So I do have that binational flavor that it really enriches the community. And talking about trans-border projects, one of the things we got to consider is that the opportunity that we have now under the U.S., Mexican, and Canada Accord, and improving the supply chains, the situation that's ongoing worldwide has really refocused this issue to have a more integrated approach on those supply chains. So that being said, that plays into many types of infrastructure. Like I mentioned before, we have 48 ports of entry. And out of those 48, 7 ports only are integrated with rail. So we need to catch up and have a more aggressive integration with rail. And this administration is really pushing rail projects. There's a couple projects that are very interested in concept. One, it's from the port of Mazatlan, will go all the way to Winnipeg, Canada. They're still finding the situation where to cross the United States, either in Texas or New Mexico. They're still debating which state has a better opportunity to enhance. But I've been involved in those discussions. It is a very interesting project. It's about $5 billion. We'll go from Mazatlan to Winnipeg. That's a perfect example of a binational project. There's another one going from Monterrey, Mexico to San Antonio. That will be a high-speed rail to integrate two major metropolitan areas in Mexico and in Texas. But I think one of the things we have to remember is we're talking about a lot of transportation, which is, I have a broad experience, but the essential thing for infrastructure is really water. And right now, we definitely have a crisis along the U.S.-Mexican border. The northern parts of states of Mexico and the southern part of the United States are really having a lot of issues with climate change and those implications on water availability. So now we're looking at potential projects to desalinate water from Mexico in the context of having binational projects. So I'm involved in a couple of projects that will, one of them will desalinate in the Gulf of Mexico and restore also part of the Salton Sea on the U.S. side and have a water swap agreement. Mexico and the United States have an agreement signed in 1944 that basically created the International Border and Water Commission on the U.S. side and the Mexican side to handle situations related to the border and particularly to water. And the Colorado River right now, it's projected for the year 2023 to have only 23% of the capacity in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. The Arizona Central project is a perfect example. The Arizona government is reaching out to the Mexican government to have types of projects that can be binational. So water is going to become a very big role. Energy sectors already something that's in. We had a major reform in the energy sector 6 years ago. And there's a lot of projects, particularly gas lines coming from Texas into Mexico. There was a big project called Los Ramones that is very successful. It was a natural gas project. And also the situation with the resiliency of the energy grid. I think Lisa talked about it a little bit. The same with kind of the United States, Mexico, and the United States, not to improve those resiliency factors for energy. And like I said before, and we had a perfect example. How can we improve also broadband and have the connectivity for the new economy? So I think there's a lot of potential for the P3 model. And I will say at the municipal level, we're working hard to my organization to have access to developing smaller scale P3 models. And I think the tone from the Mexican authorities, and we were fortunate enough to have the head of the infrastructure and investment unit yesterday mentioned that the Mexican authorities are really pushing now to have P3 as one of the models. So looking forward to a lot of projects, looking forward to having projects, brownfields that can be restructured. I agree with Morteza. There's a lot of potential in transit and those projects here, at least here in San Diego. There's a lot of them that you have prime real estate in a transit location, and you want to improve mobility and also accessibility to housing. So it covers very angles. And that will be it for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Oscar. And thank you for highlighting. I often say this, I feel like sometimes I'm a broken record, that with North America, whether it's our supply chains, whether it's the connectedness between, social relationships, but we are not linear. Everything is so intertwined. And I think you did a great job of touching on the various areas that definitely highlight that. Morteza, I'm going to change it up a little bit for you in terms of the question, because, I know we've got 20 minutes left, but I want to make sure that I ask all the questions. So let me ask this. Do you know or believe whether President Biden's infrastructure funding is going to be directed towards transnational projects or infrastructure? Or can you speak to us about that?
Sure. So the answer is the infrastructure plan that was passed. It was large enough and comprehensive enough that covers different types of projects. It has different grant programs or even technical assistance programs for small projects in disadvantaged areas, rural areas, even for tribes. It also has a couple of new programs for mega projects. There is actually a new discretionary grant program that is named after mega projects. It's a mega grant. And we have also our infra grant that has been expanded. So some of these larger projects are getting a really good chunk of the new money, the same way that the smaller projects are getting attention. But I want to also go to where Oscar was mentioning a few things about the importance of looking at infrastructure as a comprehensive set of projects and not just one sector. It's not just transportation. But we talk about infrastructure, especially transformational projects that we're talking about for future of mobility, we need to integrate different types of infrastructure. For example, if you're talking about EV charging stations, it's not just the charging station itself that we need to build in US. And by the way, there is a lot of money, I believe over $5 billion of grants that is going to build a good network of EV charging stations across US, so we can have them everywhere and hopefully see a boost in the number of EV cars in US. But going back to that example, so you need to build the EV charging station. You need to figure out the model, and that's one of the challenges right now, that we still don't know how that model is going to be. Whether it's going to be something that states are going to own and operate, whether it's going to be something that private sector is going to own and operate, or a utility type model. We don't know yet. We need to also build the infrastructure that is needed to connect that EV charging station to the grid. And we also need to make sure that we are generating enough electricity, enough energy to support this new demand for electric cars. We need to make sure that we have backup. So we need to have enough batteries that are going to restore enough energy, that just in case our grid system goes down, all of our charging stations are not going down, and all of our vehicles are not out of commission. So it's all related. You can see that how all of these are related to each other, and how we as Department of Transportation need to work with Department of Energy to develop this whole system. And that's why a new office, joint office, has been created between Department of Energy and Department of Transportation to coordinate the efforts. Switching gears, when we talk about mobility and transportation, we can finance transit projects. I mentioned earlier that transit-oriented development is one of our top priorities right now. So it's not just about building more transit. It's also about understanding how this transit is going to play a role in day-to-day activities of people. Because at the end of the day, if you build transit, but if you don't develop around that transit station so people can actually move there and have a dense area that they can live there, or they can work there and use this transit system to get to where they want to go, you're not going to be successful, because you're not going to have a high ridership on your transit project either. So that's another area that we are working very closely with HUD, which is in charge of our housing development in U.S. And we have joint programs. We're working with them very closely to make sure that as we finance or fund transit projects and expand them in U.S., the area, especially the walking distance area, which is about half a mile, could be about 800 meters of walking distance around that station, we have a very good critical look at all the land around it and figure out how we can develop it. Not only fancy apartments and restaurants and shops, but also how we can make it affordable for people who are not making a lot of money to be able to live in that area and take advantage of the transit. And that's one of the big areas that I mentioned earlier. I see a great opportunity for public-private partnerships in U.S. because these developments I'm talking about, they're oftentimes massive developments. They're complicated. They incorporate not only transportation elements, which is the transit piece, the station, could be sidewalks, could be accessibility for disabled people, but it can also include the real estate development, which is something that private sector has a lot of experience doing that, and making sure that this whole thing as a system is going to work. Another area that they can think about is, again, coordination with Department of Energy for offshore wind farms. As you know, that's another area that is growing very fast, but this equipment, the turbines that need to be transported off the shore and be installed there, they need a special capacity within the port. And also to transport them to the port, we need to make sure that our roadways are designed to let these massive infrastructures go through and get to the port. And we need to make sure that we have enough infrastructure in the port to be able to not only install them, but also maintain them in the future. We probably need a special barges or ships that we need to build. So all of that, again, it talks about the importance of working across different agencies and make sure that these massive transformational projects that we're talking about are being designed and delivered in a way that incorporates all of those elements.
Thank you so much, Morteza. I think that's great news to hear about the joint team between the two agencies. I think oftentimes when people set out to take on some of these projects, they look at it in a silo. And so the fact that we're hearing that this is being looked at in a more cohesive, comprehensive, collective perspective, makes it more certain to be successful in terms of understanding all of the complexities and the challenges, because it's not just about, as you're all saying, it's not just about this or that. It's the combination of all of it together. And you're spot on. I do a lot of work with supply chains and watching how a multinational company will set itself up in an area, but what they do is to make sure that there's going to be affordable, sustainable housing before they set themselves up there, because they need an employee base to lean from, right? Whether it's the new EV battery plants that we're seeing, pop up in Canada or the US, it's that same way of thinking of it. So thank you. I think that's you brought up some excellent points. So we have 13 minutes left on the clock. We've got a question here from Gioti. So Lisa, I'm going to start back up with you. So how does Canada deal with cross-border, multi-country, different P3 frameworks, laws, and political risks? And again, I know that's a very, very broad question. So pick what you want from it and share what you can. I know it's, again, another loaded question, but if you can impart some of the wisdom you have to us, that would be helpful. Lessons learned that other countries can take away from when dealing with these cross-border agreements.
Well, wisdom is a strong word, but I'll do my best to answer the question. And I think the point had been brought up, as well from David and Morteza, in terms of, Canada, very similar to the US, is not a Canadian market. It's a bunch of different provinces and territories with different sort of approaches to things. I mean, I think how we deal with it, I think, depends on what you're dealing with. What is the project? What are the jurisdictions that are involved? One significant difference between the Canadian context and our southern counterparts, both in the US and in Mexico, is there is no PPP legislation in Canada. It's not necessary. Our legal system allows for it, and so we don't inherently need those types of things to move forward with projects. With the exception of Quebec, but that's a slightly different. But it's just one province across the country. It's generally the same. I mean, I think the things you need to think about, and I don't think that, I mean, whether it's between provinces or between countries, I think there's things you need to think about, and it's largely around governance, right? You've got different systems of government, you've got different election cycles, you've got legislation or different, decision-making processes. I think Morteza also sort of brought up, they're looking at value for money slightly differently now. And so, in the project specific areas, how do you develop a project when your decision-making processes are different, and what you might need for decision makers in terms of a value for money analysis or other types of requirements? How do you satisfy, what both or multiple governments involved need? And there's also sort of the life cycle governance, even just getting a project off the ground, permitting challenges, utilities, which are inherent, land acquisition. I mean, all of those are inherent. These are large, complex projects, especially in the civil side where you've got long linear. I mean, that's a problem just within one jurisdiction, let alone multiple municipalities, state, provinces, federal systems that you've got to deal with. So I think there's a lot, and I think sometimes one of the criticisms that people can have about PPPs, but I would argue it's not a PPP argument. It's large and complex projects. They take time to develop, regardless. I mean, they're big. It's going to take years to make sure that you're getting it right. You add into that, that interjurisdictional conversation, and that it adds significant, layers. And so I think that there's no one size fits all. It's going to depend on what part of the world you're in, how many jurisdictions, and again, municipalities, states, provinces, federal governments. I mean, we've got Indigenous communities we have to consider in the Canadian context as well too. So it's layers, and so you've got to kind of collaboration I think is key. And how do you work together and have a governance structure that allows for a project to develop that meets the needs of all of the jurisdictions involved, but then is also packaged in a way that's going to be attractive to the private sector. So, I'd like to say that my wisdom says that here's the solution, but it's a case by case. It's really a case by case scenario, I think, from our perspective.
Well, that definitely tells me that you have some wisdom, because I think it was Sam yesterday or somebody that said, not one P3 fits another, right? Like that you can't say, okay, I've done one, so they're all the same. Each one has its unique complexities and challenges. And so thank you. Oscar, what can you tell us in 2 minutes about the complexities with cross-border challenges? Oh, you're on mute.
I think Lisa hit it on the nose. What we need is governance. Projects of this nature take a long time to develop. So, we have different political systems, different terms, obviously different laws, common law versus civil law. We have a highly centralized decision process in Mexico versus United States, even in Canada, where there's more local lies. But I think one of the things is to create, why not propose a specialized P3 unit for binational projects? That would be something that would be very interesting to promote among countries. We have a framework of many things. We have the, at least over here in the United States and Mexico, we have border master plan. We got the NAT Bank. We have other institutions that are already there, and we can leverage that and create a highly specialized unit for binational projects in the multiple sectors I just mentioned before. So I think that's important to have that long-term view. The Biden administration has recaptured the high-level economic discussion. It was previously with Obama, and so that's back. And there's a lot of opportunities with that. Funding will be an issue. I like Morteza's approach that the private activity bonds. Why not create a special private activity bond solely for the border, and have that opportunity to fund projects, or at least have some equity that's subordinate, in those initiatives. So governance is the issue, and long-term high-level discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Oscar. And Morteza, I'm going to ask you the same question. What are your thoughts in just a couple of minutes that you would suggest to our audience at large?
I will maybe make it a little bit more general, not just cross-border type of projects, but in general P3 projects. There are a couple of rules that we need to follow, and I'm sure you're going to hear about these rules again and again and again during this event. One is P3 projects are complicated, so to expect that complexity, but our job is to make it simple. Our job is to not make it more complicated. Try to figure out how you can make it simpler in any way you can. Two is making sure that we do not try to copy one model and use it for another project, another place, for different stakeholders. Try to figure out what fits well for that new project and the new stakeholders. And it's not very complicated to figure that out. All you need to do is to make sure that you identify all the stakeholders, you do some research about them, go and talk to them, understand what they want, understand what they don't want. Try to figure out if you can find a common ground that you can bring all of those stakeholders together and really engage them early in the process. That's what I did for I-66, bringing everyone to the table, creating an advisory committee early on. Everyone was telling me that, are you crazy? You're bringing all these people who are going to yell at you in the room and trying to keep them informed and engaged throughout the process. Yes, it was difficult, but it's much more difficult if you keep them in darkness and all the way at the end. You want to sign the contract and expect these people to support you. That's not going to happen. And then finally, I think what's really important is to make sure that you use P3s where it makes sense. P3s, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. If a P3 model is not going to work in certain circumstances, don't try to force it. And that's what I was always telling people, that the reason that our program in Virginia was so successful, and for over 20 years, we had continuously projects to work on and projects to procure and develop under our P3 program, was the fact that we were actually saying no to a lot of projects. You can have 10 good projects, create credibility for your program, but that one project that's going to go south is going to completely ruin credibility of your program, and then everything is going to collapse. So be careful. my view, P3s work well when there is room for private sector to take advantage of opportunities. And I know a lot of people talk about risk allocation in P3s and the fact that through that risk allocation, you're going to create value. Yes, to some extent, that's the case. But the biggest thing for me for P3 projects, and this is how I select whether I should do a P3 project or not. I mean, not now because we're not project sponsor at federal level, but when I was at the state level, was to look at the opportunities that are on the table and whether private sector has the opportunity to step in and get innovative. Private financing is good, but it's more expensive than public financing, pretty much in every single case. What is truly the value driver in P3 deals is that opportunity that private sector has to get innovative, to truly integrate design and construction and that long-term view and customer satisfaction and customer service and coming up with a system that is superior altogether in long term over life of the project compared to what a public entity can put together on its own. And if the opportunity is there for them to get innovative, bring them on board. If it's not, forget about it. Just go and do it your traditional way. Use them when the opportunity exists next time.
Well, those are some great takeaways, Morteza. I think I got let's simplify, not make it more complicated. Don't try to put a square peg in a round hole, and let's be innovative. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lisa, Oscar, Morteza, David, for such a great dialogue that we were able to share with our audience today. Much appreciated. David, I don't know if you have any parting words, but that's it for me, just with great thanks to have such an esteemed panel today.
Thank you, Laurie. Once somebody said to me this expression, keep it simple, stupid, something along those lines. And often, I think people try and make PPPs more complex than they need to be when they don't need to be. I also think it's very important that we focus on finding solutions. So if a challenge or a problem arises, don't throw up your hands in despair and walk away from the project, because we know what we can do. It just takes the will of everyone to, instead of being vindictive, trying to be collaborative, because as I say, PPPs are like a marriage. It can be a great marriage, or it can end up in a horrible divorce and everyone suffers, and the divorce is not the option. So thank you very much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. If you allow me, I want to also thank the panel.
Yes, please, Ziad.
It is great to have you guys. We have a very active North American chapter, and with the leadership of David, Laurie, Oscar, and Wayne. And we would like to do a lot more. We have been in the past, perhaps, just because we started out in Europe with more activity in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, but certainly North America is definitely of great interest to us. So we'd love to develop better connections with Canadian Council, Lisa, and with Build Back America, Morteza. Would love to continue this cooperation. Thank you very much for joining us for this annual Congress.
Well, thank you, everyone, and see you next year, and with the North American chapter even sooner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.